Well, hey guys, welcome to another episode of the TG Wellbeing podcast. I'm Dr. Victoria Munoz. This is Adam Santos, and we've got a lot of good things about testosterone and anabolics for you today.
Yeah, and here we are again. Another day. I love these. As I've always said, super informative. I'm always leaving with more knowledge, and it's really what this is all about, to kind of hash out the questions that you viewers, have, and that I have, that, we all kind of have. So, to kick it off today, obviously there's anabolic and androgenic effects, but what are the differences between those two when utilizing testosterone?
Yeah, so the androgenic effects are more of the male pattern characteristics that can come with an anabolic. So naturally, men produce about 2.5 to 11 milligrams of testosterone daily, as opposed to women, they produce 0.25 milligrams daily naturally. And so the increase in the levels is what determines the androgenic effect of the testosterone. Anabolic means growth. So the anabolic effect would be more of affecting our bone density, our muscle mass, and just brain health and overall well-being. So the anabolic effect of the testosterone is more on a growth level, and the androgenic is more on a male pattern characteristic level. And so, like I said, it's dose related. When women are given TRT, we give it in the appropriate amount so they don't get the androgenic effect, they get the anabolic effect, and it works beautifully.
Interesting. No, that makes sense. And and with testosterone, there's bound testosterone. What's the difference, or what is that exactly, free versus bound?
Yeah, so free testosterone is free to do work. Men have about 2% of their testosterone is free. With women, it's about 1%. And the bound is just testosterone is bound to a carrier protein like sex hormone binding globulin or albumin. So the difference between these two carrier proteins is that sex hormone binding globulin binds to testosterone about 1,000 times stronger than albumin, yet albumin is available in the blood about 1,000 times more. And so they both have their benefits. Albumin holds on to testosterone a little more loosely, so that when it passes a cell that requires testosterone, it can give it up more easily, whereas the sex hormone binding globulin binds to it a lot more strongly, and it's there when it's needed, but it's really needed when it releases the testosterone.
Interesting. So with the testosterone being in the cell, I guess my question, how does it know when to release, or how long does it take for the cell to release testosterone back into circulation?
Yeah, so there's just this feedback loop with the hypothalamus, the gonads, the adrenals, and the cells of the body, and they all talk to one another every second of the day. So when levels start to go down, then the hypothalamus stimulates the gonads and the adrenals to produce more testosterone, and then the cells receive it. And the testosterone, how it gets into the cell is the androgen receptors are not actually on the surface of the cell, it's inside of the cytoplasm of the cell. So testosterone can diffuse through the cell wall easily, but once it's inside the cell, it binds to a carrier protein or the androgen receptor. That carrier protein carries testosterone to the nucleus of the cell where the DNA is and causes transcription of specific genes. If we're talking about a muscle cell, it'll cause the transcription of actin and myosin, and then the effect of that will be increased muscle mass and strength, for example.
Yeah. No, interesting. And so with the testosterone, if I heard you correctly, binding to the androgen receptors is what you're saying. Does everybody have equal amount of androgen receptors? Does that vary in the body, person specific? Is that different?
Yeah, so the presence of androgen, we'll just use testosterone for our example. The presence of testosterone causes an increase in production of androgen receptors. So the more testosterone that's available, the more androgen receptors will be produced as a result. So it's very specific that way, not really gender specific. even though men by nature have more amounts of testosterone at any given time. So that would determine an increase in the androgen receptor production. Women obviously have lower levels of testosterone by nature, so they would have lower levels of androgen receptor production. However, it's interesting in that men and women both get a very similar anabolic effect, even though women's levels are lower, because they don't require as much testosterone for the benefit, like for brain health, sex drive, bone density, and even muscle mass.
Interesting. And you know, of course, testosterone is going to increase muscle mass. It should, you know, if it's being prescribed correctly. But what effect does it have on body fat metabolism as well?
Yeah, so fat cells have androgen receptors. And what testosterone does is it causes a lipolytic effect with the fat cells. So here's how it works. Estrogen and testosterone kind of work in opposition in terms of fat metabolism and catabolism. The more androgen, the less fat you're going to store in your body. And the less androgen, the more fat you're going to store. In addition to that, the more estrogen you have, the more fat you're going to store, and the less estrogen you have, the less fat you're going to store. So they kind of work in opposition of one another, even though estrogen is also, believe it or not, necessary for an anabolic effect to the muscle and the body in general, but in different amounts. So the testosterone and estrogen work very synergistic together, but they also work in opposition. And it really is like dose related and level related.
Yeah.
Like men, when they get older, as we've talked about, their testosterone can have a tendency to go down and the estradiol goes up. And that's what causes them to have a greater propensity for osteoporosis, for example, which is the brittling of the bones. Their muscle mass goes down, so they end up with sarcopenia. And they also have a tendency to store more fat on their body, especially visceral fat. And as we know, visceral fat is very inflammatory, which sets us up for heart disease and other things.
Yeah. You know, and I know last week you had mentioned, you know, slowly incorporating the testosterone, not just jumping into it. And I'd imagine, you know, one of the things you mentioned was you don't have side effects with your patients because you take it, you know, very appropriately. And obviously it's balancing the testosterone, estrogen, like you said, they kind of work in opposition, but you also need estrogen for the anabolic effect.
Yeah.
So, you know, how does testosterone stimulate muscle growth? You know, how does it stimulate muscle growth, but how do you balance that out to ensure that you're not getting detrimental effects?
So there's several ways that testosterone stimulates or benefits muscle growth and retention. The first one is a direct effect, where the testosterone has a direct effect on the cell, attaches to that androgen receptor, and causes the production of actin and myosin, increasing the muscle strength and the muscle endurance. Then there's an indirect effect. So this essentially is not a direct effect on the androgen receptor, but how the testosterone affects other hormones. So insulin, for example, is responsible for the mobility of amino acids and nutrients into the cell. Testosterone is not, but testosterone does affect insulin's ability to do that. So that's kind of an indirect way of how we attain muscle growth and muscle retention. The next way is the anti-glucocorticoid effect. So cortisol, as many of you know, is catabolic. It breaks down muscle tissue. Testosterone is anabolic, where it builds up and helps you retain muscle tissue. Well, interestingly enough, testosterone has an affinity for the glucocorticoid receptor on the cell. It will actually knock cortisol off the receptor and take over that role, and then create a more anabolic effect with the muscle. So that's another way that testosterone works to create more anabolism, right? And then also the presence of testosterone will cause the increase in production of IGF-1 receptors on the muscle cells as well. And as many of us know, IGF-1 has a direct relationship with human growth hormone. So as you know, human growth hormone is also a very anabolic hormone. So these are the four major ways that testosterone boosts muscle growth and muscle retention.
So what effects does creatine phosphate have on muscle tissue synthesis?
So creatine phosphate is what we produce naturally. What it does is it causes the manufacturing of ATP. ATP is our energy source, right? So it causes the manufacturing of ATP. It also facilitates the recovery of ADP to ATP. So that's one benefit. And what's important to understand about creatine phosphate is it not only affects muscle tissue, but it also affects brain cell tissue. So like if you use creatine monohydrate, for example, during your workout or even an hour beforehand, it's not only going to stimulate the drive of your workout and your recovery, but also your focus, your concentration, and a lot of your drive is coming from your nervous system, not necessarily the muscle cells directly.
So how are binding proteins affected with oral versus injectable anabolics?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because we had touched a little bit on possible oral testosterone cypionate before. We do have oral options, and it's not testosterone cypionate specifically. But just in general, how it works is that oral anabolics, which are perfectly safe and effective if they're prescribed by a doctor like myself, have a greater effect on decreasing sex hormone binding globulin, whereas an injectable will have a less effect of decreasing it. Now, decreasing sex hormone binding globulin basically means that more testosterone is free and available to do work, which gives you a more anabolic effect, a better drive with your workouts, better muscle growth and retention, for example. However, binding proteins are very important because they protect the steroids from being rapidly metabolized. They ensure even blood levels of the hormone, and they also facilitate the transfer of the hormone to the cells that need it. So there's some benefits to it, the levels being a little bit lower for a more anabolic effect, but we also don't want them to be so low that we don't get a stability in our hormone levels as a result.
Okay. And with that, I mean, you said, oral testosterone or oral, enhancements can be good prescribed by a doctor. Are there any available that you suggest specifically for testosterone, or do you primarily suggest an injectable?
Well, for the majority of our patients, we're using testosterone cypionate. There are some exceptions to the rule, and everybody's a little bit different. So sometimes I'll add a faster acting mixed with the cypionate, or a slower acting if we're not getting the response that we want with the cypionate alone. However, we do have two orals that I can prescribe. One is Winstrol, and the other one is Anavar. And I can actually prescribe these for men and women. It is very safe and effective. The beauty of using these, especially with women, is that they offer the anabolic effect without the adrenergic effect. So they can be 10 times more powerful in their anabolic effect, and just especially getting women out of these menopausal breakdowns, right, with all these symptoms. They tend to get out of it more easily. They feel a lot better without any adrenergic effects. But we can also use it with men too. And it works beautifully in helping to optimize hormones, get those levels within a good range, get that anabolic effect that we want safely and effectively, and just overall well-being and health.
And for specifically for men, my question, they could take just Winstrol and Anavar alone without like a testosterone alongside of it?
I often will combine them. So we can do something with the testosterone, maybe give a low dose testosterone cypionate, men and women, and then do the Anavar. We could do it daily. We could do it then we could take it right before they work out, for example. But we're always monitoring blood levels to make sure that we stay within a normal range for testosterone, because it affects our testosterone levels. So it is perfectly safe and effective. You can use the oral anabolic alone by itself, or you can use it in combination with an injectable. And just depending on the patient and how they respond, we'll determine that.
Okay. And with those, obviously like testosterone cypionate for somebody that may be on it for life, that needs it because they're not producing, is Anavar and Winstrol something that somebody can remain on almost indefinitely per se, or is that something that would need to be cycled on and off?
No, absolutely. I mean, they can stay on it indefinitely. If they are on an injectable as well, the benefit of like somebody who works out, bodybuilder, whatever, let's say they work out 4 days a week. Well, you don't really have to cycle it because they're not taking it every day. So it's not a bad idea to cycle it depending on where their training's at and what they're doing. And it's perfectly legal for me to prescribe it. So that's why, I encourage it. And like if they're prepping for a show, maybe they're going to use less of the injectable, a little more of the oral, for example. If they're building and they're in their building phase, then they might do both together.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, a lot of information today. I think it's a lot of information that a lot of people out there want to know. Our members, I'm sure, this is something that would be very informative for them. I always learn a lot. I always have takeaways from it. Really, I don't have any more questions. I mean, you answered above and beyond as always. So, I really appreciate your knowledge, the information that you provide, and I always appreciate these podcasts that we do every Wednesday.
Yeah,
so.
They are a lot of fun. Yeah. And hey, guys, I hope we're bringing value to your health and your wellness. Here we talk mostly about hormones and hormone production. We kind of throw in a little bit about nutrition and other things. But always check in here every Tuesday for our TG Wellbeing podcast. And definitely subscribe to the channel because there's other great pearls, other videos that will bring value to your life. I'm Dr. Victoria Munoz. This is Adam Santos, and see you next time. Boom.
Awesome.